I want to thank everybody who is already on and joining us today. I'm Diane Hirschberg. I'm the director of ISER. And before we jump into today's program, I do want to acknowledge that ISER's offices and my home are located on the ancestral and unceded traditional territory of the Dayna people, and express my gratefulness for their stewardship of this beautiful place, and thank the native village of Eklutna for welcoming us to their lands. And I'd also then like to invite Dr. John Nofsinger, Dean of the UAA College of Business and Public Policy, to extend his welcome to all of you participating in this webinar today.
Thank you, Diane. Welcome, everyone. As you know, ISER is known for its nonpartisan top-shelf analysis on important Alaskan social and economic issues. Throughout the decade, wherever we are, we often hear, what does ISER have to say about that? Well, today we get to learn about the new generation of ISER researchers who will shape Alaska's policy well into the future. So going forward, depending on the topic, you'll probably be hearing, well, what does Dayna, Mary, Jen, or Brett have to say about that? Today, we might get some insights, so welcome.
And thank you, John. So this month marks the start of ISER's 61st year. As many of you know, ISER was established by the state legislature in April 1961 as a business, economics, and public administration research program for the purpose of developing and publishing statistics and other information regarding the economy, government, and resources of the state. For 60 years, we've done this and more, studying not only key economic, resource, and governance issues, but also health, education, and social welfare issues, with a significant amount of work focused on Indigenous policy issues. ISER's scope is also extended beyond Alaska to encompass the Arctic and beyond, and we've collaborated with researchers across the state and across the globe. In December, we celebrated ISER's 60th by looking back at the work we've done over the years studying the permanent fund dividend. Now we want to look forward to think about how we meet the state's emerging needs and to learn more about the goals and interests of our next generation of researchers. We are honored to have Lee Gorsuch joining us in this discussion to offer his thoughts on some of the topics our researchers raise and to give us perspective on other issues we may want to address in the next few years. I assume very few of you who don't know Lee, Edward Lee Gorsuch joined UAA in 1976 as the second director of the Institute of Social and Economic Research, or back then the Institute of Social, Economic, and Governmental Research. He served in this position until 1994, which makes him the longest serving director at ISER. He presided over numerous changes, including moving ISER from Fairbanks to Anchorage. And while ISER director, Lee also served as Dean of the School of Public Affairs from 1988 to 1994. He was named UAA Chancellor in 1994, a position he held until 2004, making him the longest serving chancellor in UAA's history. And in addition to his work at UAA, Lee Gorsuch served as a frequent advisor to executive and legislative branches of federal, state, and local government on a number of public policy issues. 6 years on the Anchorage School Board, and in 1996, he was appointed by President Bill Clinton to the U.S. Arctic Research Commission. After leaving UAA, Lee Gorsuch served as president of City University of Seattle from 2006 to 2013. So really happy to have him involved here. Just a quick note before we proceed. We welcome audience members to pose questions in the Q&A. You'll see a little box at the bottom of the screen. We also encourage you to think about what issues we might not currently be exploring and share those with us as well so that our panelists might reflect on new ideas too. And with that, we're going to turn to our panelists. Each of them is going to spend about 7 minutes introducing themselves, their research agenda, and what fascinates them or gets them excited about doing research in Alaska. And then Lee and I will ask questions, and the panelists can also call on each other as well. And then we hope again that you all will share some thoughts and questions with us in the Q&A. And with that, I would like to start with Dr. Dayna DeFeo.
Hi there, I'm so glad to be here. My name is Dayna, as Diane said, Dayna DeFeo. I grew up on the East Coast, and that'll probably be pretty apparent. When I get excited, my East Coast accent comes out a little bit stronger, and I'm excited about ISER and all the work that we do. So I grew up on the East Coast. I did my graduate work in New Mexico, and I moved to Alaska in 2010. I started with ISER, I said 2014, but now I think it might have been 2015, but I've been here about 5 or 6 years. I'm working right now as a research faculty member. So to talk a little bit about my research agenda, when I first started at ISER, because I was research faculty, a lot of what I did was driven by available funding. But in the last couple of years and with my colleagues' help, I've sort of hit my stride there. And so I would categorize my research in 3 key areas. One of the big things that I do is teacher turnover, supply, and demand. I look at the teacher workforce and the things that affect our ability to recruit and retain educators in our K-12 classrooms in Alaska. It's not probably most people here know that Alaska has a teacher shortage, but it's also a nationwide teacher shortage. And so thinking about how Alaska can continue to meet its workforce development needs and its teacher workforce needs is one of the things that I'm studying right now. I'm working on a National Science Foundation project to look at how compensation and working conditions together predict teacher choices in where they choose to work. Teachers vote with their feet. And so by studying where they go and what they get in different places, we hope to better understand some of the dynamics that can help us improve our ability to recruit and retain teachers. I also look at education for workforce development. I'm really interested in how we prepare youth to be citizens in our Alaskan economy. And I'm interested in college and post-secondary transitions, including programs that affect and prepare youth for that, high school outcomes, dual credit programs, and I've lately become interested in working on a project with Brett in the aspirations that people have for themselves and when they start to develop ideas about what they want to do for their careers and what influences that. And I have a couple of different projects in this area. I'm working on Alaska Native Education Program grant with in collaboration with Excel Alaska, and a Title III grant in collaboration with the UAS Sitka campus to look at some of those questions. And I would say the third area that my research falls into is a sub area, I guess, of education for workforce development is the STEM education workforce. I'm very interested in diversifying the STEM workforce, helping non-STEM students, people who decide not to pursue careers in science or mathematics or technology or engineering, to become more literate voters and consumers of science information. So just improving science and STEM education at the K-12 level, and also hopefully bringing more people into the STEM workforce. And I have 3 different projects there that I'm working on with the National Science Foundation. I was told to also talk about what excites me about working in Alaska, but should I maybe hold off and allow others to introduce themselves first?
Finish up with that.
Why am I excited to do work in Alaska? So, well, I bet I have a lot of the same comments that my colleagues and co-panelists will say, but I think, Alaska, for one, it's a great place to do research. It's so diverse. We have so much diversity in geography and places and urban and rural spaces. When we look at our teachers, we look at our students, we look at the communities that represent our great state. I find that I can do research that's very particular to Alaska, but then becomes broadly generalizable to lots of other places in the US. And so with that, I brainstormed ahead of this meeting, so I thought of 4 things. So number 2, the thing that I'm interested in is, so much of Alaska research is done in partnership. In my field, we do a lot of implementation-based work. And so I have the opportunity and privilege to work with these brilliant people doing great work in schools and communities and with parents and teachers and kids. And I get to work alongside people who are doing phenomenal work. And then the research gets to describe some of that work. And I get excited about that. And related to that at ISER, I love doing this interdisciplinary stuff that we do. I've learned so much from my colleagues who come from different fields and have different disciplinary orientations, who use different research questions and methods and approaches. And I think it makes me a lot more critical. I think it strengthens the quality of the work that I'm able to produce with my colleagues. And lastly, I would just say that working at ISER, the policy aspects of the work that we do are amazing. I think before I came to ISER, when I was doing other types of education research, I was really wondering whoever consumed it, what good it served, if anybody read it other than like-minded researchers doing the exact same thing as me. And, just this legislative session, I've been able to testify, I think 4 times. And so it's pretty amazing in our state that, working, that you're able to do that you're able to be there and have those conversations. And so I know that by working at ISER, it doesn't just push me to do high quality, relevant research, but it also increases the visibility and usefulness of the work that I do. And I'm just so happy to be here.
Wonderful. So next I'd like to turn to Brett Watson.
Hi, folks. My name is Brett Watson, and I'm a resource economist here at ISER. I've been at ISER since 2017, came up from Colorado, where I got my PhD at the Colorado School of Mines. And as you can imagine, with that degree and working in Alaska and being a resource economist, my research focuses on Alaska's really abundant natural resource wealth. And so I look at issues related to our fisheries, our mineral deposits, and our oil and gas fields. And then I also look at not only how that wealth is generated and managed in those places, but then also how that wealth is distributed back to the people of Alaska through our very unique PFD program. And so I've got research projects that have kind of touched on each of those facets of work. Most recently, a colleague and I, Bob Loeffler, came out with a report that looks at the future of the Alaska mining industry over the next 20 years. We kind of shine the headlights out as far as they can reach and see and ask the question, is that industry going to have the potential to replace oil and gas as the main economic engine of Alaska? Bob and I have some skepticism about that, but can it be a robust source of employment and economic opportunity for the state? Can it create supply chains for these critical materials that have generated so much interest over the last decade? And we find the answer to that question is probably yes. On the oil and gas space, some of my work has touched on potential changes that the state might make to our oil and gas tax policy, what effect that might have on the industry and their choice to make investments in the state, the effect that it might have on jobs in that industry, and what effect it might have on state revenue. Another important question that we need to understand here as a state that's dependent on that resource. I mentioned work on state fisheries. So recent work there has looked at how local fishermen create different economic impacts for their communities than fishermen that come from other communities in the state. And here we're not even thinking about fishermen that are coming outside the state of Alaska to come fish in our waters, but folks that might live in Anchorage and go fish in Bristol Bay for the summer. Those effects have different economic impacts in those places. And then lastly, I mentioned that some of my work also touches on how natural resource wealth is distributed via the permanent fund dividend program, how we distribute our oil wealth here in the state, and the different socioeconomic impacts that has on people and their communities here. So got some research that looks at the PFD's effect on crime in the state of Alaska, its effects on children's health, and other potential research coming down the pipe with my colleagues here at ISER, including Mary, and I bet she'll speak to some of that in her introduction. And then finally, what excites me about going forward and doing research here in the state of Alaska? Well, I think Dayna mentioned an important one, which is, ISER is very close to public policy making in the state, which is a really exciting place for a researcher to sit. Prior to coming to ISER, a lot of the research that I did, I know would go and sit on a shelf somewhere and gather dust. And while I was always very proud of the work that was gathering dust, gather dust nonetheless it did. Here, it's very exciting to be close to policymaking and to answer questions that are policy relevant, not only here in Alaska, but also nationally, as Dayna mentioned. Being in a state with the resource wealth that Alaska has, being a resource economist is obviously very exciting. alignment between me and some of the issues that the state faces. But then one thing that I think that Alaska may not get enough credit for is the amount of policy innovation that takes place here. I mentioned how unique the PFD program is internationally in how states think about managing their natural resource wealth, particularly oil wealth. It's a fairly unique program globally. And being in a state that has a history of that policy innovation is really exciting. Another example is that this year, Alaska will implement its new election system, ranked choice voting, which is kind of a brand new experiment in democracy. And so here we have, kind of this unique program about how our elections are handled that's very unique to the state of Alaska, this PFD program about how to manage our natural resource wealth that's very unique. And it just demonstrates that Alaska is not afraid to innovate when it comes to cutting edge public policy. And I think that that's an exciting space to sit in too. So glad to be with these other great panelists here tonight talking about their research, and happy to talk to other folks in the community about what's exciting them about the future of Alaska research too.
Thank you, Brett. So we'll turn to Mary now. Mary Kapriva.
Hi, yeah, my name is Mary Kaprifa, and I'm the newest addition to ISER here. I think I just started in August, so I've only been here about 9 months, and I'm really enjoying it so far. I'm originally from Rapid City, South Dakota in the Black Hills area, and I completed my PhD in economics this past spring at the University of Oregon. So I'm a health economist. So broadly, that means that my research kind of focuses on questions about how economic conditions affect health status and health access. And the flip side of that, how health status and healthcare access can impact an individual's economic outcomes. More specifically, my research really focuses on questions related to women and children's health and questions about intimate partner violence or domestic violence. And then I've also done some work on tribal policy. So some of the work that I've looked at in the past has examined things like breastfeeding, fertility, and intimate partner homicide, like I talked about. For example, I guess one of my recent research projects has examined the impact of a free healthcare program for women in Armenia and the impact of that on the prevalence and duration of breastfeeding. And finding that there's some partial evidence of impacts for duration with kind of little evidence of impacts on the likelihood of actually taking up breastfeeding as a result of this policy. As well, I've also done some work on tribal policy. Like I mentioned, I have a project that analyzes the relocation program, which was a federal program that aimed to move Native Americans in the lower 48 off of reservations and into urban areas around mid-20th century. In that project, I'm kind of looking at two main outcomes, migration and fertility, and I find that as a result of the program, about 100,000 Native Americans moved to these target cities. And then also that second generation Native American women saw lower fertility rates in the target cities versus women who remained on the reservations. So kind of showing those long-term effects of this type of program on migration as kind of an economic outcome, and then health looking longer term forward to that next generation. So since starting at ISER just in August, I've been kind of working on a couple projects related to the PFD. That's, I think, where my research here in Alaska is starting. And it's particularly interesting as a health economist to be able to study the PFD, because one of the problems we always face as health economists is trying to tease out the effects of economics and health when we know that the relationship is really bidirectional. So how income affects health, health's also going to affect your income level. So having something like the PFD, which is kind of this outside effect on income, is a really fun way to study what the effect of income is on health here. So two of the main outcomes that I'm looking at with relation to the PFD right now is the impacts of the PFD on maternal health. So looking at the timing of the PFD during pregnancy, so during the first, second, or third trimester, on maternal health outcomes at the time of delivery, labor and delivery, things like perineal lacerations or excessive bleeding. And then the second project that I'm kind of just getting going on would look at the effects of the PFD on intimate partner violence, and particularly focusing on that short-term effects, just looking at the time right around PFD receipt each year. So kind of that's a little bit of where I'm starting and looking even farther into the future, I guess, and thinking about what I'm excited about with working here in Alaska. Continuing to do work on the PFD is certainly part of that, looking at other maternal and infant health outcomes, as well as kind of a broader range of medium and long-term effects on domestic violence outcomes. But then also examining other interesting questions that are really specific to Alaska too, like things about subsistence activities and nutrition and the impacts of that on maternal and health outcomes, particularly as we think about, climates changing and subsistence activities changing in response. And then also thinking about, and this is maybe related to some of Dayna's work, thinking about healthcare workforce development. And just like the rest of the country, that's something that we as Alaskans are facing as well. So starting to do some research in that area too.
Thank you, Mary. And Jennifer Schmidt.
Hi, my name's Jen Schmidt, and I'm an assistant professor of natural resource policy and management here at ISER. I've actually been in Alaska for nearly 20 years. I moved up here in 2002 and spent most of my time in Fairbanks, but moved down to Anchorage in 2015, around that time. And I guess as far as my research agenda, the research that I do, it's pretty diverse. And, that's partially because, my training was interdisciplinary. So I cover, several different topics, but also there's a wide variety of research needs by Alaska residents. And so I very much try to be responsive to things that Alaskans want. And also ISER is a diverse workplace, and a lot of the topics that ISER addresses cover many different things, and just be responsive to the demands. But like Dayna, I have a few main themes of research that I cover. First of which is food, water, energy security. So I have a project where trying to look at food, energy, water security in rural Alaska, and I developed a framework that can look at and assess different components of food, water, energy security. So we just can't say, oh, you're low, oh, you're high, but really delve into what are the drivers of food, energy, water security, so that we might be able to identify potential solutions or potential, policies that influence food, energy, and water security. And within that kind of realm, I do various things such as electric vehicles. I was just in rural Alaska looking at the feasibility of electric vehicles in rural Alaska. One of the communities that I was near supposedly has $16 a gallon gas. It's hard to go out and do subsistence activities when gas is that expensive, let alone anything. So, trying to find a way where, Alaskans can deal with the expensive energy costs that are out there, and also not be left behind in some of the technological advances that are happening around the rest of the United States. Also, with that, I have projects that look at the cost of electricity and the effects of power outages. I was working with folks at Berkeley and doing some surveys of communities in rural Alaska. So again, I think energy security is a big topic for the state. As far as food goes, in the past, I've done a lot of research that looks at subsistence, subsistence as far as land use, how is technology affecting subsistence harvest, climate change. Much of my work deals with, I do interviews, workshops, community meetings, and surveys. So really getting out there and talking to people, which is also one of the things that excites me about the work that I do. Is I get to interact with people and run into just some very awesome residents in rural Alaska. We have such great people here. Another theme among my research is natural hazards. So I have projects that look at wildfire, permafrost thaw, and rain and winter events. And obviously I cannot be the expert of all of those things. So I try to build interdisciplinary teams and bring in the experts to solve some of the complex issues that we're dealing with in the state. I think that, going forward, climate change is creating a lot of changes and challenges for the state. And one of those is, natural hazards. We recently had that avalanche here in Anchorage. Among the natural hazards, I primarily deal with wildfire. So I have a number of projects that are on wildfire. I do a lot of GIS, so mapping out what these hazards look like. I've made some wildfire hazard maps for Anchorage, Fairbanks, and Whitehorse. And with that, there's a lot of community engagement. This Saturday, I also will be busy with work. I have a Hillside Firewise event that will be happening from 11 to 3. Where I'll be making a big poster, giving presentation, just trying to promote awareness of wildfire hazards around the Anchorage municipality and how can we better prepare for them and be able to mitigate any potential negative consequences from wildfire and adapt, because it's something that's not going away. Also with wildfire, one of the few things that we have to help mitigate wildfire is fuel treatments. And so I have a couple of projects that deal with fuel treatments, one of which is looking at the social and ecological components of fuel treatments. How can we develop them in a way where they last longer? So therefore, they'll be more economically feasible. And that might be manipulating the vegetation to keep lower flammability fuel in these fuel treatments. And fuel treatments are where you go through and you remove vegetation to remove the flammability and also allow firefighters to get in there and do their job and help keep wildfires out of urban areas. And then part of that is looking at the social acceptance. Not everyone might be happy with a large fuel break around their house. You know, if you come in and clear out all the vegetation, I can see the bears wandering around, but you know, it might not be the best for the resale value of my house. I'm also, that's when I'm working actually with Brett on. And let's see, some of the other things, I'm starting a project looking at wildlife conflicts in Juneau. Juneau has quite a number of human-bear interactions, and so I'm excited to work with people up at UAF and ADF&G to look at, you know, the human conflict and wildlife issue down there. I mean, I think that's something that could be hopefully expanded into Anchorage. We certainly have a number of bears that run around Anchorage here. And then one of the other things that I have been working on recently is cancer education. And while it's not particularly my background, I'm doing that because that was something that community members told me that they wanted. I do work with the Northwest Arctic Borough out in that area, and it was identified as a real need. And so I was recently out there holding the first ever Northwest Arctic Borough Cancer Week. I got to go out there and talk with kids in the school, talk with community members, and you know, to wrap it up, what excites me, you know, like the other people have said, doing work that benefits Alaska and helping communities and residents make informed decisions. I mean, I love this state. I've moved around a lot, but this is my home and this is where I want to be, and I want to contribute in a positive manner. And doing my job at ISER allows me to do that.
Thanks, Jen. So we actually have a question, which I think Jen partially answered and other people partially answered, which is who determines the topics of research by ISER? And it really is this mix of individual researcher interests, community questions that come to us, policymaker questions that come to us, and sometimes it's other researchers who approach us and say, hey, I've got a great idea. Would you like to work on it with me? So, you know, some of it is also our interests or these other factors and the availability of funding, because unfortunately we don't have an endowment that allows us to do research without having to bring in some funding. But we're lucky enough that we've got some really talented grant writers here who've been able to bring in a really good amount of external funding, and we have a policy audience that at times is interested in supporting us in doing this work. So so it really is that mix. I might actually, yes.
Dan, I was just going to say, for anybody, members of the general public or other researchers who are interested in a question or a project, I would really strongly encourage you to reach out to ISER. I'm embarrassed to say I don't know our general email address. Diane can probably fill us in, or to email researchers directly. We are also pretty well networked and often can point people in the direction of resources or other potential collaborators if we're not best suited to answer a question ourselves. So we want to hear from you, so please reach out.
That's a really good point. And actually, if you go to iseralaska.org, all of us are, and our emails are listed under the people section. And so, because sometimes the general email doesn't get read for a while. I'm wondering, Lee, before we jump into some other questions, if you have any thoughts about, this diversity of work that you're hearing about from our more recent generation of researchers.
Well, first of all, Diana, I'm delighted to see that ISER continues to attract top quality faculty and staff to carry out its mission. That's really encouraging. And I also wanted to congratulate you and Ralph and Gunnar for withstanding these horrific financial hurdles that the university has been experiencing over the past several years. I know it's a trying time for everyone, but it's to your testimony and of the rest of the staff that you're held in sufficient regard not to be on the cutting room floor as the university continues to make very difficult financial decisions. For me, thinking back, there's a lot of similarities to what the current activities are with what I also suspect will be the future activities. So for me, the real drivers over the next decade are going to be climate related, globally, nationally, statewide, local, and they are going to be so pervasive. I mean, all of our rural communities on waterways, we've got tremendous infrastructure problems associated with permafrost. I mean, the list is quite large and long. So I'm really encouraged that you've got faculty who carry interest in those particular areas, because I think they're going to be of real significance. I've always worried about the integrity of the Alaska pipeline, since their vertical support membranes are on permafrost ground, and as we see global warming, what's that integrity going to look like for the Alaska pipeline? But that's a very specific idea. But the second one is close to your heart as well as mine, and that is the idea that Alaska's demographics have changed significantly. It used to be that we paid high wages and could attract people into the state. And I don't know how long ago it was that Alaska's migration turned negative, and it was only through natural population growth that we experienced population. And so I think increasingly Alaska can have to grow its own. So I'm delighted that several of you are interested in the notion of, workforce development, educational attainment. It's discouraging to me to see that we still have these enormous, if not growing, disparities on race and gender. So, when I was chancellor, I was dismayed to see that 20% of our Alaska Native graduates were male, 80% were female. So somehow males were just not into the sort of higher education pipeline, which is going to be, I think, a significant challenge culturally and socially downstream. So I'm really excited that you're looking at partnerships with innovative programs in school districts and so forth, and looking at these salary conditions. And one of the big losses of recent years has been this two-tier system in our healthcare benefits. That used to be a huge attraction. In addition to salary, Alaska was very generous in its provisions for benefits. And I guess if I have my own personal wish, I never was able to do this, and I don't think the politics will probably ever provide it. But I came to Alaska with the Alaska Native Land Claim Settlement Act, and in that act was a huge social experiment, which was trying to convert American capitalism into the Alaska Native culture, under the theory that money is power, and if you have money, you'll exercise power. And through that power, you can protect your other interests, whether it's subsistence or other social programs and benefits. It's now been 50 years since ANCSA was passed. And I'd be really curious to have an in-depth look at what has been the effects of the Settlement Act on a whole variety of issues that permeate throughout Alaska, as well as intimately in the Alaska Native community. That's a totally separate personal interest I have, but it's rife with all kinds of political problems and challenges. So I'm not quite sure that it would lend itself to that. But I also just wanted to say how grateful I am to Vic Fisher, because Vic recruited me to come to the Institute, and it was one of the most satisfying experiences I've had in my professional life. And I hope all of you continue to enjoy the wonderful environment that Vic established of collegiality and friendship within the ISER community. It was really rewarding. I look forward to going to work every day, and I'm delighted to see that faculty who are speaking seem to feel that same sentiment.
Wonderful. So we've got some questions, and again, encourage if anybody's listening who wants to ask questions, please put them in the Q&A. But I might actually start with one that's could be a little bit fun, because all of us who are here have come from someplace else. I don't think anybody participating here is was born in Alaska. So what is a really interesting or important fact that you've learned in your work that you think all Alaskans should know? And it can be more than one.
I guess I'll go first. I mean, I guess when I read this, thought about this, to me, I'd mentioned that I go around and I talk to a lot of people. I visit a lot of communities, and I'm just amazed at how resilient, hardworking, and creative Alaskans are. I have the confidence that, if we work together, we can make things happen. I mean, there's a lot of doom and gloom in the world, but I'm just incredibly proud of the people that we have here.
I can say that it's hard to pick just one thing that I found fascinating, but I would echo what Jen said, and also note that the more and more I do work in the social sciences, and I work with my colleagues and look at the interdisciplinary ways to approach project, I recognize that the world is complex. And I just look at education in particular, but when I sit next to someone on an airplane, I often am told about the one quick fix that we need to fix all of the problems in education. And I'd like to make 2 points there, is that these are wicked problems. There are a lot of different things that go into these problems. There's a lot of nuance, but also teachers are working hard. Parents are doing an amazing job. Superintendents, principals are all doing amazing work in our state. And while we recognize that these are wicked, complex problems that we need to solve with the minds and voices and input of different disciplines and people and stakeholders, to also recognize and celebrate some of the really beautiful work that is being done and that is happening in our state, particularly in the school systems where I spend most of my time.
I don't know, Mary, if you're new, if you've had a chance to have that aha.
Yeah, I think, being new, I'm still learning a lot. So I think that that's kind of where I'm at with this one still, I suppose. One thing that has been interesting as a health economist, and maybe this is a little less happy or exciting and more of a challenge that's interesting, I suppose, is thinking about our healthcare costs here and just how high they are. And I think a lot of people probably know that healthcare costs are high in Alaska, but the fact that they're growing, and they're growing faster than the rest of the US, I think is also, a challenge clearly for the people of Alaska here, but something that, especially with all the new innovations that are coming out of the pandemic and new ways of doing things, kind of what that can look like going forward in ways where we can maybe tackle some of those challenges.
Diane, I'd also just sort of jump in and say that for me, one thing that was the most disheartening was during the financial difficulty the state was experiencing in the 1980s, they eliminated the Legislative Research Agency. So legislation was not being benefited by having staff members actually carefully pursue examination of alternative practices in other countries and states and nations and so forth. And then along, with that has been sort of the loss of policy analysts inside so many agencies. So the state of Alaska's agencies are oftentimes without a rudder. They get no opportunity to get systematic feedback to assess the success or efficacy. So for me, the big aha is the unique and extremely important role the university plays in trying to basically bridge that information void. ISER is one of the few institutions that really has as its mission trying to understand some of these forces and consequences that impact the lives of Alaskans, sometimes on an everyday basis, in other instances on a long-term basis. So I think it's just important for all of us to realize the precious role the university plays in bringing objectivity and analysis to some really very critical and as Dayna was saying, very thorny issues. There's not a silver bullet out there that's going to solve the education challenges or find that sweet spot of policy for oil and gas development or mining development. It takes a really thorough, careful analysis to sort through these thorns and thickets and come up with some meaningful assessments. So for me, it really was just to sort of appreciate the unique and important role that the university plays in general and that ISER plays in that whole social economic policy arena.
So I think maybe the most interesting fact that is actually something that I think maybe all Alaskans know, but something that's maybe highlighted by things that something that non-Alaskans don't know, is thinking about the state's fiscal situation. I don't know if any of you have had the experience of explaining some of the state's recent fiscal troubles to anyone from outside the state. And you say, the state's in a real crunch right now. The size of our permanent fund dividend last year was quite a bit smaller than it's been historically. And people say, oh, what does that mean? Well, in Alaska, we don't pay the government to live here. The government pays us. And people kind of say, wait, let me stop you. And they express quite a bit of confusion. All that to say that Alaska is in a somewhat enviable position from the standpoint of people outside the state. We've got a lot of the tools that we need to solve some of our fiscal problems right here. Whether it be our natural resource wealth or the wealth that's generated from Alaska's people and the innovation here. Or the size of the permanent fund itself, right? So all of these tools are available to us, and I think that we've got the creativity to solve these problems. But like I said, something that I think all Alaskans know, but can only be reminded of when we speak to folks from outside the state, is this, like I said, enviable position that we find ourselves in on some occasions.
So as we've been talking about policy issues and working with lawmakers, and as you think about your research and your research area and reflect on, ISER's been doing this for 60 years. What is the most important question you think you'd like to focus on, or that we need to answer related to your particular research area right now, looking at the current status of the state?
I would say it's one that's already been mentioned, in that, climate related impacts to society and the environment. I mean, they kind of go hand in hand. It was mentioned the pipeline and the effects of, say, thawing permafrost on the pipeline not only affects infrastructure, but also people dependent on the oil revenues coming out of the pipeline. So to me, how do we use the current information that we have on climate change? Because a lot of research has been done on it. So how do we use it to adapt and mitigate and kind of prepare for what we might expect to see in the future? There could be some opportunities there. One of the things I've been thinking about is when I go down to the lower 48, it's hot. It's too hot for me. And I run back up to Alaska where it's a nice temperature. And so, maybe this is a place we're going to see a lot of influx of people, from the lower 48. And can we be prepared for that? Just thinking about my research and what I do, and so what kind of pressure would that put on, say, the hiking trails, recreation around the Anchorage area? I think with COVID and everybody wanting to go out on the trails, we kind of saw that the use was very intense, and maybe there are different ways to manage, say hiking, recreating like that, given changes partially driven by climate. So that to me is kind of one of the more important questions related to what I do.
For me, I would say that a big area, and I don't know that this is the most important one. I think that there are lots of important topics, but one that's I've been thinking a lot about lately that I think the state needs to really tackle is one of education funding for K-12. And that's complex because it's not just one issue. It's everything from how much the base student allocation should be to the geographic cost differentials that help us distribute funds more equitably between our different school districts and communities. But even bigger than that are issues of adequacy and equity and how we can achieve those in our school system and how school funding both drives and supports that. School funding is a big issue. It's one of the biggest expenditures in the state budget. I mean, we invest a lot in this, and I think understanding that better and making policy to do that more equitably is a high priority for me and some of the research that I do. I'm not an ed finance person myself, but I see a tremendous need and hope to support that work.
I think I kind of set myself up for answering this question with the last one, which is, I think one big question that most Alaskans probably have as well as me is just trying to better understand why these healthcare costs are so high here. And I think even more than that, really trying to understand why we're not getting the health benefits from those high costs too, is that we're not really, we have these high costs and we, still have bottom third life expectancy in the US. So we're not getting the health for our payments here. So hopefully I can kind of work on some of that, even though it's maybe not directly in my research as well. So I'm going to add a second question too, which is something that I think hopefully I'll be able to do working with some of the people in the Justice Lab and criminologists is looking into more of some of the economic policies and things that we can think about related to domestic violence, which we know is also kind of a pervasive problem here in Alaska. So I think kind of the big problem and the problem that's maybe a little bit more related to my work, or the question a little more related to my work.
One of the topics that I'm thinking about quite a bit lately is, again, how to manage our natural resource wealth. So I had mentioned the PFD, but also issues around coming up with the right policy around our oil royalties and production taxes. Are they too high? Are they too low? What encourages investment, but also allows the state to operate effectively? But other forms of resource taxes too. I mean, fish landing taxes or our community development program or development quota program around fisheries, thinking about this issue of natural resource wealth management is important too. We need to think about ways to maximize that resource wealth, but also distribute it in an equitable way. So I think that those are all topics that'll be kind of front and center in my research agenda.
Diana had a question for Dayna. Alaska has been toying with the significant benefits of distance delivery in educational programs for decades. And it's pretty much, I'd say, failed up until perhaps the last decade. I'm not current, but I'm curious whether or not the pandemic and school closures as a result of the pandemic, forcing so many school districts to go into distance education, has had any lingering positive effects. Or is the evidence such that students have really suffered rather than benefited from the exposure to distance education?
That's a tough question, I'll say. Lee, I'd say two things. The access to and quality of distance education that we were able to deliver as a state during the pandemic, I think fell along the same lines where we see a lot of education inequities playing out already. So access to devices, access to high-speed internet, teachers who had the resources that they need to deliver the instruction. So I think the effects of the pandemic are we're going to see them coming out in subsequent years of data. But I think that the quality of instruction and devices and resources and tools and tech were not equitably distributed throughout the state and even within some of our urban communities. So I think we have a lot of equity work to do there still. And I know that Diane recently did some work about access to broadband in school communities. And I know she's not a panelist, but she might be able to supplement some of the things that I said with some of her recent research.
Well, and I was going to say that it actually relates to a question that we have on the lack of broadband being a barrier, in this case, for one of our audience members who's a clinical psychologist. And so he's asking about studies to address this. And we did, and again, this was a study that was a request from legislative budget and audit asking for a look at the cost of broadband in school districts. But to do that, we had to understand broadband access, and broadband is a moving target. And actually, it's probably one of the places where it's a moving target in a good sense, that while we were working on the report, hundreds of satellites were being shot up into the air for low Earth orbit satellites that could provide more internet access. Unfortunately, about 50 of them fell when they got hit by some kind of a solar flare. And I guess there was a solar flare yesterday or today, so hopefully some more didn't fall. But this is a really critical issue that we have. It's that there's the expense. There's also that middle mile problem, that even if we're getting broadband into communities, are we getting it where it needs to be in those communities? And then there's the ability to actually use it. There are many places where school districts might have access to better internet speeds, but they don't actually have the equipment in the school then to take advantage of that. And the students may not have the technology, and certainly at home, they may not have adults who know how to make this work. And so we've got, I think, a huge number of issues around this. It's a very important set of questions, and it's opportunities to learn, and it's opportunities for commerce that we could be doing a whole lot more in terms of economic development. We could have coding, we could have server farms in places where it's cold, and we have renewable energy. But we're definitely behind in taking advantage of what's come in to the state, and whether it's satellite or the quintillion line that was put into place in the north. Jen, you had some.
Oh yeah, I mean, I can kind of tie the two questions in the chat together, in that, it's been 2 years since I've been out to rural Alaska because of COVID. I haven't been able to go out and do the research that I normally do, but I was really impressed with the increase in speeds and 4G on my phone in some of the communities, which I did not have before. But then there's also that issue that it's not really sometimes where you want it. In the schools, the internet was not very good in the schools. And I would think the schools are really where you want to have some good internet access, but it was definitely lagging there. So there are some improvements, but there's definitely, a lot of work still to be done.
And I do think that question about how COVID has affected our research, everybody here probably has multiple stories about what it has done to research for us and our colleagues.
I was going to take that. I think in many ways, like Jen, I was unable to do a lot of visits. A lot of the implementation projects that we had planned in communities didn't happen, but an opportunity that we saw in COVID was to look at the role of student teaching in teacher preparedness. And so Alaska has, for several years, participated. ISER has run surveys of education graduates throughout the state of Alaska, and we participate in a national consortium, so the data get normed. So we have multiple years of data looking at sort of how student teaching affects pre-service teachers, people who are right about to go into the classroom, their readiness to go into the classroom. And throughout all of the education literature, student teaching is regarded as one of the most important experiences that a teacher can have before they go into the field. It's important, they get support, they get mentored. And so as awful as COVID was, it did create an interesting natural experiment that we were able to exploit. We had a whole cohort of new teachers who didn't have a student teaching experience or who had a very truncated student teaching experience in a face-to-face classroom. And so we compared the spring of 20 grads to the spring of 19 grads who had what we would call a normal student teaching experience. And we were very surprised initially to find that the spring of 20 grads, and this was in a national data set looking at, I think about 4,000 teachers, including Alaska, the trends were the same here. The spring 20 grads who didn't have student teaching said they were so prepared, so much more ready for the classroom than the spring of 19 grads who had had this very structured, mentored in-class teaching experience. And we were puzzled with these data. We're working with North Dakota State University to do these analyses, but as we looked a little closer, it made sense that student teaching sort of serves as a reality check for people who have only studied these things in theory or practiced in the classroom with the college classroom. When you get into the K-12 classroom with real kids and real parents, it's not as easy as we might have told ourselves. And so the COVID context created this really nice opportunity for us to look at the value of this regular practice that we rarely have the opportunity to do experiments on because we regard it as so valuable. And my takeaway is that our findings actually show a lot of support for a supported student teaching experience, but also note that our new teachers who are coming up in a time of COVID, who are having their classroom student teaching experiences interrupted, are going to need a lot of support when they get into the classrooms on their own. Teachers all over need support right now to work with COVID, but especially the new ones. And we hope to continue to do research that helps us think about how to support them better.
I think there's also an interesting follow-up to that, which is what's the new normal going to look like? And a question about agencies planning to continue to use virtual platforms to encourage comments from a wider segment of the population going forward. I don't know if anybody has thoughts about that, because of course, I think in some ways, again, back to something Dayna said earlier, Alaska might be ahead of the game in general in the way that we use distance technology where available, such as going to the legislative, when we can, going to the LIO offices, the legislative information offices, and being able to testify in different parts of the state, or being able to do online comments. But do others have thoughts about what you've seen with maybe how virtual platforms transform engagement?
I was talking with an agency recently, and they noted that they get a lot more feedback from the public with this virtual platform and the ability for people to dial in that way. And they were happy that the public was more engaged in some of the decisions that were being made. And so, I mean, while I can't speak for them, based on that kind of feedback, it seems like it would be something that would be continued in the future to help, continue to encourage the public to participate in the decision process. Also, I had a meeting with agencies where we could have gotten together in person, but, we defaulted to virtual. And so to me, that also indicates that, the ease of the virtual atmosphere isn't going to go away.
So I might ask a question, and then we can get back to also questions from the audience. So I might start with Lee on this, and then see if others want to reflect on this as well, which is in an increasingly partisan world, how does an institute like ISER stay nonpartisan?
Well, that's really a difficult challenge, Diane. Ideally, you stay one step ahead of the actual policy formulation. So on so many of these questions, once a legislator has formed a bill, it immediately divides the support or opposition to any kind of research into whether you're for or you're against. So somehow I think the big challenge is there some way of tackling these issues, whether it's related to climate change, education, and so forth, before someone tries to put a solution forward, just to get a better understanding of the lay of the land and the pros and the cons that are out there. But I think it's really hard, and I've been dismayed that during the pandemic, as well as some of the debates on climate change, science has been degraded in the eyes of so many partisans that it's difficult then to maintain credibility. So I think it's really important for the Institute to try to maintain that obvious objective independence from the policy makers to the actual substance of a potential policy discussion. The other has to do with the communications of the work that you're doing. During my tenure, the big innovation was to write very brief abstracts of the research in layman terms. So what did you learn as a result of your work? And then typically it would be picked up by the newspaper ran it, then the TV station would come out and interview the researcher. And then all of a sudden the public is getting some kind of awareness. But in this new age of communications, I really don't know what are the most effective ways in which your research actually can permeate into the public consciousness. So I'd be interested to hear from other people about their ideas about what has worked well in terms of trying to bring information that you've gained, insights that you've acquired, to basically generate that back out to the public.
Besides the ISER TikTok channel?
So on this question about how does ISER maintain its role as a nonpartisan institute thinking about policy, I think that our role in providing an honest broker of facts really can't be understated here, right? And so I think that to the extent that we can, letting the work speak for itself is really important. We can let others draw conclusions from that work in terms of as Lee said, the actual bill that gets written up from it, but kind of providing an assessment of the information as we see it, and then explaining it in a way that allows others, an opportunity to critique it, right, from their vantage point, I think is also important. And I think it helps to broaden folks' understanding there. On the question of communication, so I don't know, me and a couple of other researchers have found Twitter to be a pretty effective communication platform. I think, under the old paradigm, to a certain extent, your research lost your own voice when it was distributed through an intermediary, through traditional media outlets. On social media, you're given an opportunity to present your research in your own voice and to allow members of the public and other people in traditional media outlets who are also on Twitter to understand things through that perspective of your outlet. So I think that that's been an interesting change that's maybe occurred over the last 5 years in research.
And Brett, I might also say that letting the facts speak for themselves highlights for me the importance of the decennial census, that it gets thoroughly analyzed and presented in terms of basic demographic changes. So when Mary's trying to get her handle around healthcare costs, the aging of the Alaska population is probably one of the single biggest drivers. So if the Institute's able to help project what does that aging population look like in 20, 30 or whatever it is, and what are the likely consequences if you maintain the same program delivery services, that would be a huge contribution to people who are worried about, how do we do these cost containments and still provide a decent quality of service.
To what Brett said, I'd just like to add, I have yet to enter into the social media Twitter arena, and I know that this is something I need to do. But what I've been reflecting on a lot lately, thinking about communication, is different audiences and not waiting until I have a finding to reach out and communicate, but to work with stakeholders from the formulation of the research question to communication about the protocol procedures and having them weigh in on it, to helping me make sense of the preliminary findings. I know that as a researcher, I've got a responsibility, but I've been really focused on communicating at every step of the way around some of these different projects and to a variety of different stakeholders, and hearing their voices, not as not at the end, but all the way through, and finding ways to make sure that I'm being sensitive and inclusive of those voices as I'm building the project. So social media could probably help me to do that better as well. And Brett, I know I need to take some lessons from you, but my spirit is there. I just need to get caught up with the tech.
So Mary, I might put you a little on the spotlight because I'm thinking about your experience with testifying, and that experience of what it was like when you are trying to present really good, I think, really solid research, and you've got legislators on both sides of the aisle trying to make a statement, right? And while you're doing these talks, and I think all of us, I know, Brett and Dayna and I have all been on that hot seat with, people asking questions that are not really questions of the research we've done, that are questions that are, a position point disguised as a question. But I'm wondering if you want to reflect on how you navigate, or what your learnings are from trying to navigate, keeping the focus on what Brett was saying, what the facts are saying, and what it's like in this, often very difficult environment.
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, coming from academia and having, kind of fairly recently graduated, I'm used to what Dayna and Brett both mentioned at the top of this, where my research kind of goes and collects dust on the shelf. So I think first and foremost, it's actually just really exciting and cool that our research does reach policymakers and that we get to do things like testify, because you feel so much more engaged with the community, and like this work is really, out there and it's in the mix here. So I think that's kind of upfront first thoughts. Then also, and I think Brett mentioned this kind of in his answer too, I think the first and foremost thing as researchers is to just do our best research first, because then you can always just fall back on that. And I think that means, taking a really critical lens to your own research, getting feedback from others, pushing it as far as you can, so that when other people ask you questions, you really know it inside and out and can rely on those numbers and feel confident in what you're presenting.
Just don't take the bait.
We also actually, I even though when we were doing that kind of practice, we actually had some fun, but I thought it was really useful also for me, thinking about my own testimony, to again do an internal rehearsal, throw questions at each other, try to anticipate those difficult things that are going to come up. Brett has been involved in some stuff that could be very lightning attracting recently. And so I know you've been involved in some very thoughtful conversations about how to present the research in a way that people really see, no, this is, yes, we might have people review our research so that we make sure we are being accurate, but that is not changing the perspective that we are bringing to this as something that is really, it's ISER's research that is unbiased.
I think that we're all prepared to do, we're doing this community engaged work and we're doing a lot of applied work, but one thing I also don't want to forget, and I think Mary was talking about this too, is that we do put our work through peer review, and that process is a quality mechanism that helps us to show not only the quality of the work we do, but the rigor of the methods and the applicability of the work. And I think that even though we do a lot of applied work and we do things in Alaska, that the value of that peer review showing that we're relevant and rigorous is highly valuable. Sorry about the beagle.
I'll just add that I think an important thing that I try to point out is that my perspective is incomplete, right? That anything that I put out, any report that I work on, any paper that I write, is the perspective of an economist with, kind of a resource economics background, right? And that's the lens that I approach things with, and that somebody with a different lens might look at the same question and arrive at a different answer. Doesn't necessarily mean that the method that I applied is illegitimate or incomplete, but it is incomplete, right? But it doesn't mean that it's illegitimate. And I think that that's one of the nice things about working at ISER, is that we can kind of add a lot of different types of voices to the chorus of work. Individually our perspectives are incomplete. Collectively, they're slightly less incomplete.
Well, I have a couple of things I'd like to add is I think transparency is very important. And also, the biases and assumptions that go into the data that you're using. The census was mentioned. Well, some things have changed with the 2020 census. So being open and clear about what does that mean for what we're seeing in the data and the interpretations that we can draw from the data. And then as far as communication goes, I think it's highly dependent on who is your audience. Again, in rural Alaska, Twitter might not work so well out there. The radio worked well. So we went on the radio and had an interview with that. So that was broadcast across out to the villages. But at the same time, we did engage with some young people to do the Snapchat stuff and Twitter. So just a diversity in how we try to communicate our findings. And I definitely agree in involving people early in the process. I did that, and I basically had to redo one of my products based on the feedback from the community.
So one more fun question. Every once in a while, ISER gets lucky and there's a foundation that decides to support us with a pretty broad mandate. And so if we were to be so lucky as to have a Ford Foundation or a ConocoPhillips or another entity come and hand us, $1 million, probably with no indirect, just so you know, and say, go do important research. What is that project that each of you might not otherwise be able to find funding to do that you'd really like to do?
This is tough, Diane, because the world doesn't usually work this way. Off the top of my head, I think there would be a lot of value in adding some more mixed methods approaches to some of the questions that we've already started. So when we do some of this quantitative work and draw conclusions, I did make some notes on this ahead of time. I really think there would be value in taking the time to do a qualitative complement to explore the nuance that goes along with those quantitative findings. And conversely, when we do qualitative work, it would be nice to follow up and do some more quantitative work to figure out how generalizable those data or those findings are, and to what extent those affect bigger populations than the ones that we were able to cover in our research. So I feel like I would like to take the questions that I've already done very focused work on and go quant, and some of the quant stuff and go qual. I think we're working on some really important questions, and we just never have enough time to do all that we need to do to really understand the complexity.
Yeah, I agree with Dayna. This is it's a pretty big question. And I guess for me, there's several things that I would love to do, but maybe, there's this idea that always keeps getting tossed around, including me tossing it around, is, adaptive capacity. But, what do we really mean by adaptive capacity? As an academic person, we can look in the literature and say, well, this is how it's defined. You need to measure these things. But really, does that translate in into the ability of communities of residents to be able to handle situations that are thrown at them. So I think more research maybe needs to go into, developing how do you really capture adaptive capacity. And some research has been showing that there's a social component in that, a psychology to it. What are people's attitudes? Kind of how are they feeling? Are they optimistic? Are they pessimistic? So even though you might have a high, quote, adaptive capacity as we assess it now, that might not mean anything because maybe people are kind of down in the dumps or just negative towards something. So to me, I think better understanding the topic of adaptive capacity and how it really translates into how we can be more prepared for the future.
I've been thinking a little bit recently about the energy transition that the global economy is going through. Alaska's economy has been dependent for the last 40, 50 years on oil extraction. And sometime in the future, we don't know exactly when, that's going to change pretty dramatically. What does our economy look like after the last drop of oil flows through the pipeline is a really big question. And I think one that ISER can, I think, contribute to and answer towards, is it our tourism economy? Is it our other natural resources? Is it our geostrategic location? What things can we potentially capitalize on, the resources that we already have, thinking about this transition as we go through it? And how do we kind of shepherd workers that are in that industry now through that transition out the other side successfully? Those are kind of the questions that I have my eye on looking forward.
Question that I've been really interested in coming up here to Alaska is looking at subsistence activity and nutrition, and especially as we look at like changing climate and kind of the larger challenges facing Alaska. I think looking at how those changes in subsistence activities and nutrition affect particularly like early life nutrition, so in utero and early childhood, and then what the effects are of that long term, and thinking about long-term economic outcomes in particular, things like educational attainment and employment and income, and just kind of being able to take a really broad lens to it and look at those long-term impacts.
So there's one last question, which is really two questions that are related from the audience, which is about aging. And there's a question about how do we address this need? And there's a comment about that we're seeing big growth in terms of an aging population, and people typically are moving less at older ages, but what works in different regions as an idea, which I think is a really good one. And, what else should we be trying to understand about our aging population? I know, for example, today I was talking with a medical researcher from Ohio State who was asking about our population of physicians. She does physician training as well. And I was talking about the lack of services for older adults and how hard it is in terms of insurance, how hard it is in terms of doctors. So I don't know if there are other thoughts on how we might approach some of these critical issues about aging as policy researchers at ISER.
There are a lot of problems that are created through an aging population. And Dayna had mentioned workforce issues. I mean, and there's only two ways. On the flip side, though, there are only two potential solutions to that problem. Either we need to have more babies or we need to have more immigrants. And so in some ways, the problem is relatively simple in that there are only two potential solutions to it. But obviously, in those two potential solutions lives infinite complexity beyond that. So I'll stop with my my cute answer before I venture into more unknown territory.
There is a third solution, but I'm not in favor of it.
I guess this is maybe the obvious answer too, which is looking at our healthcare costs again. And I think more than just looking at the costs is how do we really get the benefits that Alaskans deserve and need and want out of the money that we're spending. And then kind of hand in hand with that is just healthcare workforce development, which is, like I said, something that everyone in the US is kind of dealing with right now, but what can we really do to kind of adopt good policies for creating solutions to that problem? And then maybe also with COVID, kind of thinking about what policies have maybe worked and things that we adopted in the short time that we might want to bring forward, like thinking about how we do licensing for out-of-state mental health workers and what that could look like going forward. So I think those are kind of a lot of the big questions that would go along with this in health.
I guess, related to the stuff that I do have some graduate students looking at, commercial fishing and, interviewing commercial fishermen and asking them about why they may not be fishing anymore, why they're going, say, to a different location in Alaska to fish. And there have been some publications on the grain of the fleet, among commercial fishermen. So again, it kind of gets back to why are young people not doing it? And then, okay, if the barriers are identified, can there be policies changed or made to help make it easier for young people to get into commercial fishing or people to stay within commercial fishing? Just a small example of that. But, again, it's a huge policy issue.
At first, I didn't think that there was a direct connection between this and my work, but then you think for a minute and everything in social science work is related and education always ties in. One of the things that occurs to me that we might want to look into is Alaska's ability to retain some of its bright young people through our education system to stay and work in Alaska. There are many academic programs and jobs that we need here in the state that are not that we don't have programs for. So if people go out of state to get training, how do we make sure that they come back to share all of that knowledge and skill with the state? And so thinking about how the education system can work to fill the workforce development needs that go with an aging population is a place where I'd like to work. The conversation I had with a former ISER economist was around some of the Alaska initiatives, the Alaska Performance Scholarship and some of the Alaska Scholars programs, and how some of the initiatives have worked so far to that end, and how we can leverage those successes and learn from those programs to do a better job with policy in the future.
And one of our colleagues, Diane King, has pointed out that aging really does impact every sector in housing and healthcare, transportation, energy, workforce. I think that's a really important point. And it also gets to some of what Dayna was talking about. And we also have another comment about the housing crisis, which contributes to out-migration from small communities and also restricts our economic stability and growth. I mean, now with what's happened to the housing costs in Anchorage during COVID, it's quite crazy. So I think I agree that is definitely something. And I know that a couple of our researchers have looked a bit at housing across the Arctic in the past, and I think that's a good issue to bring forward. So we just have a few minutes.
Just quickly to the health. Trying to bring some focus on the wellness, I think would be extremely helpful. And when I left, the native health corporations were really quite progressive in their innovative programming and so forth. And it might be a very propitious opportunity to partner with them to examine the variety of wellness within the Alaska Native community, to be able to help promote the practices that actually support healthy lifestyles among the aging Alaska Native population. The numbers are small enough, the communities are diverse enough that you might have a very robust ability to do comparisons. And I think the Native corporations might well be very supportive of that kind of initiative if they're not already doing it themselves.
That's great. So Lee, with that, I was going to say we just have a couple of minutes left, and I wanted to give you kind of a chance to share any other thoughts now, having listened to this as somebody who who really was formative in helping shape ISER. What, any final thoughts that you have for us as we look at moving into this next 60 years?
Well, not really. I mean, I'm impressed of the thoughtfulness that already is taking place among the research agenda that's being pursued. I don't have any sort of broad insights that faculty aren't already well aware of. Probably the the biggest challenge is to be thinking ahead. I mean, while it's important to focus on the project you're working on, it's always important to be thinking about the next steps, the next policy questions that are likely to arise. And as you had mentioned, probably one of the biggest challenges that I faced as a director was the financial wherewithal of the Institute. That recruit good faculty, but then find research opportunities to put their skills to work. So cultivating those relationships, I think, is really important. And I was impressed to learn that you're already doing, a number of faculty are already doing some international collaborations, which sometimes are in fashion, sometimes they're out of fashion. But I was pleased to see that there is some ongoing research now that involves, neighbors in Canada and other, Arctic countries, as well as other Native American organizations and so forth. So I do think the idea of partnerships is critical. I did spend a fair amount of time trying to cultivate relationships with the big foundations and keeping my ear to the ground on what's going down with the organizations that fund supports research of our agenda. And I was delighted to see that the Institute is now participating in major National Science Foundation funding. When I came in, that was the first big ticket item. Vic had landed $1 million Man in the Arctic program. And it was sort of unprecedented at the time, one of the largest social science grants ever awarded by the National Science Foundation. And it really gave the Institute a kickstart. And one of the benefits that came out of that was the economic model that has served the Institute well from its economic analysis for decades now, and is illustrative of having some innovative tools that can be applied to a variety of different research endeavors. So keeping an eye out for those kind of things, I think, are important. One of the areas that is a lamentation again is, although we had done early on with Jack Cruz and others work on what you might call social well-being, that it wasn't just gross state product or gross national product, but how are your citizens faring in terms of health, outlook, attitude. I always regretted that there wasn't sort of an index that we could create that would be sort of the equivalent to that kind of analysis. So I was dismayed. I came up to the state maybe 10 years ago to do a little presentation and looking again at educational attainment, and was dismayed at that point that 50% of all school-age kids were on school lunch programs. That suggests an enormous dependency on a program that is fairly vulnerable to political whims and so forth. So again, I think staying cognizant of these sort of baseline issues is really important, as well as the idea of looking out to the future. But I'm really encouraged that people are optimistic. I'm delighted. I look forward to coming back up to the state in the not too distant future and get to meet some of you in person. You're fortunate to have folks like Vic Fisher, who's still available, can give you all kinds of ins and outs on the Institute history, policy making, and so forth. So as well as Scott and Gunnar and Matt and others who've been around for a long time. I'm sure they're delighted to be able to serve as a resource if anybody has any occasion to want to have someone to talk to about kicking around ideas and so forth. I'm also excited to hear that there's more interdisciplinary research. So I would again, we used to have this constant feuding with Fairbanks as it related to base research funding and so forth. But the opportunities for doing interdisciplinary research were really quite significant. And so I would encourage you all to continue to look to colleagues up north to pursue some of these issues related to, biodiversity, climate change, and so forth. There really is some very fertile ground to do some collaborative research in those arenas. But no, I'm just excited to hear that things are going as well as they are. And you've got such a talented group of faculty to work with, all of whom seem to be involved in very significant policy research. So I just hope you have the same kind of successful tenure and satisfaction and fulfillment that I had as the ISER director. So thanks for including me in your webinar.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And thank you to our fabulous faculty who participated in this. And again, for people who are interested in reaching out, you can find us and our contact information on ISER's website, iseralaska.org. And we look forward to seeing you all at our next event.